Hello, it's Tuesday the 5th of June and you're watching Scotland at 7. I'm Hugh Stewart. As you can see, I'm working at home tonight and I'm joined in tonight's programme with Chris McCusker, who's I think just a few miles to the south of me, down about Newton Mearns or so. Evening, Chris.
How
Thanks
are
for
we here?
joining. I'm not bad considering, really, but we have a top story tonight, don't we, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. Just before we went on air, we've heard of the resignation of two senior cabinet ministers from the UK government. UK government in crisis. That's our top story. And Chris and I will discuss that in just a few minutes. But first of all, I'm going to look at some of today's news from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So looking at the Ukraine updates now, Russia claims that it has control over the Luhansk region. So defending Ukrainian forces are now concentrating on the Donetsk area. Ukrainian General Staff says that Russia is now focusing on Siversk, Bakhmut and Fedorivka, which are in the Donetsk region. Russia claims to have taken over about a half of the Donetsk. Donetsk and Luhansk together form the area of the Donbass, the industrial area to the southeast of Ukraine. Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, is under constant bombardment as missiles hit the city every day, either city centre or the surrounding suburbs. Defending troops are holding their positions but taking severe heavy losses because of the constant bombardment from Russian artillery. Defending troops are fighting back with US-made howitzers, and these are guided with drone technology. However, the Ukraine military says that the Russians are outgunning them by a factor of 10 to 1 in terms of the amount of ammunition falling on the city. President Zelensky said today that he doesn't think that Belarus will formally enter the war. Although Belarus has often been used as a base for Russian activities, and several attacks on Ukrainian territory have come from within Belarus, President Zelensky says he doesn't believe that this is due to the wishes of the Belarusian people. And finally, in the Ukraine update, Finland, which of course has today joined or at least it's been made clear that they will be able to join NATO along with Sweden. Finland has today seized 865 railway trucks, which are Russian property, and this is part of the European Union-wide seizure of Russian assets, part of the sanctions against Russia for their continuing war in Ukraine. Quick bullet points today then on the Ukraine situation. We will continue to report on Ukraine as long as that conflict continues. And let's move now, Chris, on to our top story for today. As we said, literally just as we were going on air, we heard, first of all, that one senior cabinet minister has resigned, and then just a few minutes later, a second. Two top cabinet ministers, isn't it, Chris? Who's gone then?
Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid. Excuse me for smirking, folks, but I'm absolutely beaming like the Cheshire Cat here, if I can use. What I'm really surprised about is one after the other, and bearing in mind the fact that today there was an urgent question in the House of Commons regarding the whole incident, how it was treated, how it was investigated, and the reason that I bring that up is because in the two resignation letters, both MPs have categorically stated that the place of morality matters within the operation of Parliament, and both of them citing that really surprises me, because it has been ignored for well over 2 years, and now all of a sudden, both of these political heavyweights have decided to take the moral high ground, which is really bizarre. I'm really wondering what the backstory is here, because being no doubt the last 2 years have brought up some fantastical stories, and I'm just solely wondering if there's more dirt to come out of these resignations.
Well, The reason you cite for the resignations is that they said that, yeah, government's gone too far in the direction of dissembling, lying, lack of morality. That struck me this afternoon before I knew anything about resignations, but I was hearing about the story that Johnson, first of all, didn't know anything about the Chris Pincher inquiry. And of course, we will look at Chris Pincher in a minute anyway. That was going to be a top story before this one took over. But as the story came out today, because it was perfectly clear today that what Prime Minister Johnson said yesterday about the Pincher affair was not in fact true. I heard this morning actually in the press briefing number 10, the first question to the Prime Minister's press officer, not Prime Minister, of course, he wasn't there, but the press officer, his very first question was, are you going to tell us the truth today? Because he didn't yesterday. And the truth is a strange thing, isn't it, Chris? Because to you or me, somebody either did something or he didn't, or somebody either heard about it or he didn't hear about it. But the truth was being nuanced. I was listening to the words that were being used as the story came out. The truth was being massaged. It was being modified. It was being nuanced. It was clarified. So truth isn't a simple thing. Did it happen or did it no? Truth has become much more complicated these days. So are we going to begin to go back to politicians actually answering questions?
Well, I mean, that would be a breath of fresh air, a nuanced way of approaching how to do politics in Britain. But I just constantly I recall, one of Billy Connolly's most favoured jokes when he opened at the Albert Hall years ago, and he was actually, I think he was talking about Ronald Reagan, and he was trying to, Ronald Reagan was trying to qualify as to what, as to why he was lying. And it basically goes along the lines of, well, if you lie about the truth and you tell the truth about lying, I was actually not actually lying. I was actually being truthful when I was actually lying. And it's like, you need a ready reckoner and a slide rule in order to work it out. These people have been self-servitives for so long, and finally their conscience has caught up with them. And what was more interesting to me, which obviously tonight's events have totally taken me aback, but what was more engaging was to actually watch that urgent question, because obviously Labour didn't throw at the wall and miss. They completely went full tonto. And I can't remember his name, but the Paymaster General that was, ushered in order to try and explain this ludicrous situation, was, basically on the back foot, saying that, it's always the opposition that is going to go to try and make the political point. Well, the political point is, and this is something that he was missing, I think, is the fact that morality in Westminster, in any parliament, it doesn't have to be Westminster, it could be Holyrood, or it could be, any parliament in Europe. Morality has to matter, because when you play footloose and fancy free, with loose morals, you lose credibility. And as we've seen in the last 2 years, there is very, very thin on the ground of credibility within this Westminster cabal.
The big question, of course, everybody's going to be asking tonight, and that'll be continued in the news tomorrow, is will we have a new Prime Minister? So Ian Blackford has tweeted today that the Prime Minister is finished, surely he has to go now. But probably the only person who doesn't believe that is Boris Johnson himself. But previously, any Prime Minister who's got anything close to this position, Chris, with senior cabinet ministers resigning, and these are the Chancellor and the former Chancellor, they're about as senior as it gets, really, plus 148 MPs having expressed no confidence in the PM. In previous administrations, the Prime Minister would have long gone. Do you think Johnson can hang on any longer?
Yes, I do actually think that Johnson can hang on, because he has been able to hang on for this long, and it would take a tumultuous change of heart from the 1922 committee. Because what we've seen in the last couple of days is the fact that the internal workings of the Tory party are wanting to change the way that how things are done, and that includes the removal of a prime minister. And it's basically what they want to do is to hang on to power at all costs. Now, the other thing, which is far, far more frightening for me, is the fact that if Boris Johnson is removed, the questions have to be asked. Who is his replacement? Do they go for a general election? How credible is it that Keir Starmer will be elected as a Labour Prime Minister? What ramifications has that got for Scotland? Bearing in mind the last couple of days, both him and Anas Sarwar have been smooching around Westminster and telling Scotland that it can't do what it wants to do. So, it is interesting times ahead, no matter what kind of equation comes out of this.
Yes, of course. The point of the Johnson prime ministership, of course, was to get Brexit done. So that's formally done, but as we know, it's not really going to be done for many years yet because there's still a huge amount of talking. So all those difficulties facing
Brexit
are still there, aren't they?
Brexit is not done, Hugh. Brexit is not done. Far from it. And, the only reason that Boris is getting away with the fact that he got Brexit done is because the right-wing press are constantly telling us that that's why Boris Johnson is in charge of the country, because he got Brexit done. And he has brainwashed the majority of the Tory membership into believing that Brexit is done. Brexit is not done. I mean, only tonight, earlier on, I had a message from a good friend in the aviation industry that, because of Brexit, because of COVID, there are, British Airways have now cancelled another 1,200 flights, right? And that is at Heathrow and Gatwick. And it was British Airways that actually was forced into making 10,000 employees redundant. And now they're saying that they cannot recruit. And the only reason that they cannot recruit is because we have stopped the freedom of movement. And that is the end of the line.
Yeah, we've reported in previous editions of Scotland at 7 about the hospitality trade, ordinary restaurants and cafes, just not having enough staff, so they can't actually open a whole week. So the Brexit damage is certainly not finished being done. Well, obviously we'll move on now, because tomorrow when Andrew's doing the show, we'll hear if the Prime Minister's gone or not. But it certainly looks like this would be the last chance saloon, normally speaking. Before we heard about that half an hour ago, Chris, we were going to discuss the Chris Pincher inquiry, which of course is the background that led to those resignations today. So let's just read out the story. The SNP members in Westminster have called for an inquiry into whether Boris Johnson's handling of the Chris Pincher affair has broken the ministerial code, after Simon MacDonald, who had been a senior official with the Foreign Office and is now a crossbench peer, told the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner that the Prime Minister was briefed in person about a 2019 complaint of alleged groping by the former Conservative Deputy Chief Whip, who is the appropriately named Mr Pincher. Mr MacDonald's letter, which was sent to Catherine Stone, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, and tweeted on Tuesday morning, that's today, appears to demolish yesterday's insistence from the number 10 press people, that's a series of ministers, that Johnson was not aware of any specific allegations against Mr Pincher before last week. So remember, this says Johnson was aware of it in 2019. In the summer of 2019, shortly after Pincher became a Foreign Office Minister, Mr MacDonald wrote, a group of officials complained about his behaviour, and MacDonald said that these claims were similar to the complaints which emerged last week. An investigation upheld that complaint, and Pincher apologised, he added. It was, however, Mr MacDonald wrote, not true for number 10 to claim either that Johnson did not know about earlier complaints or the amended line about the only complaint he knew about being unsubstantiated. This is Mr. MacDonald quoting, who's now a Lord in the House of Lords. Mr. Johnson was briefed in person about the initiation and the outcome of the investigation, this letter said. There was a formal complaint. Allegations were resolved only in the sense that the investigation was completed. Mr. Pincher was not exonerated. To characterise these allegations as unsubstantiated is therefore wrong. In a statement referring to Simon MacDonald's letter, Brendan O'Hara, SNP's spokesperson on Cabinet Office matters, said, "The evidence from a former senior official in the Foreign Office demolishes Boris Johnson's claims and raises serious questions over whether he has lied and broken the ministerial code. There must now be a full investigation. If the Prime Minister has lied, there is no question he would have to resign." This once again places the spotlight now on how utterly broken the Westminster system is and how Scotland would be better off with independence. Well, you'd expect Brendan O'Hara to say that. So, as I said, Chris, that would have been the top story had we not heard of the resignations of Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid. But the story would have been that up to a couple of days ago, the Prime Minister was saying he appointed Chris Pincher as Deputy Chief Whip. In fact, it's been reported in the press he wanted him to be Senior Whip. And so Johnson said, I didn't know anything about allegations of his behaviour, which seems to be quite regular behaviour. However, that story from Johnson was blown out of the water today. And Mr. MacDonald is saying, you did know all about it. There was an inquiry and you decided to leave that. Right. So the fact that the inquiry was dropped doesn't mean he was found to be not guilty. It just means that the inquiry was dropped. Right. So it's a very Sir Humphrey way of doing it.
Well, I think it was, and I don't know who the lady in question was because I don't watch the mainstream British television in the morning or at any time of the day for that matter. But one of the Good Morning presenters actually put it to Dominic Raab, the fact that the complaint had been made, the complaint was upheld, and yet Dominic Raab took exception to the fact that she was referring to Chris Pincher as being guilty. Now, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh, but if someone makes a complaint and that complaint is investigated and the investigation finds out that the complaint is upheld, then surely that means that the person who the complainer was complaining about was actually guilty, and that's that. We can't get away from that. That is as plain and simple as you know it can be. You know, so I mean, what we've had all this week is Tory MPs being put on mainstream media to dumb down on you know a all too familiar story, which is not solely owned by the Tories. The Labour Party have been tainted, you know, by these allegations. You know, so has the SNP, so has the Liberal Democrats. So you know, nobody is coming out of this whiter than white, shall we say? But what you know again relates back to the earlier story or the leading story that we went with, and that is a question of morality. And when people in power, regardless of who they are, when they start abusing that power, then that is the sword that they should fall on. And if allegations are actually proven that impropriety was taken by any member of the Westminster Parliament or the Holyrood Parliament, then they should be removed from office whilst that investigation is ongoing. And, you know, to my mind, if the complainant actually wins his case, then that person should be removed from office. Plain and simple.
Yeah, I think most people would agree that, well, our elected representatives have to be accountable. And of course, a key component of that is actually answering questions and not prevaricating, not trying to hide from the truth. So I think that everybody watching is going to agree with that, Chris. So that was the story from earlier on that the Prime Minister did know about the Chris Pincher allegations from years ago, and his own cover up yesterday has today been exposed as not true by, in fact, a senior official within government who's now in the House of Lords. So we will find out tomorrow, no doubt, whether this is one lie too many for Prime Minister Johnson. So let's go on, Chris, to our next story tonight. Now, we're going to again talk about the Prime Minister. First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has today told Prime Minister Johnson that Scotland will not be refused the democratic right to choose its future in a referendum. Ms Sturgeon spoke to Prime Minister Johnson in a telephone call yesterday, reiterating her plan to press ahead with a second referendum, even without a Section 30 order from the UK government. The call is the first time the two leaders have spoken since the First Minister set out her plan for the second referendum in Holyrood last week. Following the call, the Scottish Government spokesperson said the First Minister discussed a range of topics with the Prime Minister during the brief telephone call. There was a shared recognition of the efforts of both the Scottish and UK governments in supporting the people of Ukraine, including recent financial support for military assistance and the work that has gone into helping citizens choosing to temporarily make their home in Scotland. The two leaders agreed that a heads of government meeting will take place in the near future to discuss the current cost of living crisis. More of that later tonight. Both governments will work together to develop proposals ahead of that meeting to help those most in need of support. In discussing Scotland's future, the First Minister again made it clear that the Scottish Government is ready and willing to negotiate a Section 30 order to secure a referendum on independence, and that the absence of a Section 30 order will not mean that Scotland is refused the democratic right to choose. And finally, the Prime Minister tweeted, I've spoken to Nicola Sturgeon to herald the success of the UK collaboration in supporting Ukraine. I thank the Scottish Government's £65 million contribution in upping the UK's military aid to Ukraine to £2.3 billion. And he also thanked the Scottish Government for its efforts to house 6,000 Ukrainian refugees. The Prime Minister finished saying, thank you, Scotland. Okay, we're going to do more of that in a minute. So the story is, of course, that the First Minister has now written to the Prime Minister, of course, over a week ago, and has now followed that up for a phone call, saying it really is time the UK government agreed and allowed the Scottish Government to do what it was elected to do just over a year ago. But that's it, just no answer then, just a polite response from the Prime Minister. So, Chris, what do you think of the prospects of either Prime Minister Johnson or Prime Minister Truss, or whoever it might be next week, will say, okay, Section 30 order, we can't do this any longer?
That's a scary thought, Prime Minister Truss. Jesus Lord. Look, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in Butte House today, listening to that conversation. I'm sure it was very polite and it was very cordial. I don't think that Boris Johnson would have, said anything, contrary to what Nicola had pointed out. Because I think Boris Johnson knows that he's on borrowed time. How what length that time is, God only knows. It appears to be the everlasting question of how long's a piece of string. So I mean, he will want to dodge and avoid this question as much as possible. And I think Nicola has basically got him in a pincer movement at this moment in time by obviously going to the court first and asking the court, and then the other side of the pincer would be the fact that if they call a general election and they deny us a Section 30, then she would use that as a de facto referenda. I mean, that might be be seen as a double-edged sword. it might be seen as, well, what's the point in that? It's just more, we've got another mandate and all the rest of it, and in Westminster, constantly saying no. So it really does depend. To my mind, it actually depends on what the court actually says, and once we do see what that outcome is, we can and taking the fact that Westminster will probably deny it, then we can actually, without fear or favour, call unionist politicians as democracy deniers. And at this moment in time, that's what they are effectively doing by saying that they're not going to engage with this in any such way, shape, or form. But what you actually have to read in between the lines of Boris's tweet there, because it was love bombing Scotland in a very, very big way. It was detailing the fact that we have offered money to top up the UK's money that it's given to Ukraine. So he's recognised that. He signed off the tweet with platitudes of thank you Scotland and all the rest of it. This is a tactic that Boris Johnson has not yet deployed, and it is a big case to me. It's a big case of love bombing Scotland and love bombing Nicola, because Boris Johnson has done this tactic. Well, he hasn't done this tactic directly, but if you look back at previous prime ministers' questions, he's always at pains to point out that Ian Blackford is his very, very good friend, and they got on despite their exchanges and all the rest of it. And it is, it is actually, in a way, it's very, very patronising. But what I do hope is the fact that people down south actually wake up and see, what actually Scotland contributes to the wider UK. We're not that dependent as they would like to portray us.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Of course, various members of the SNP in Westminster last week talking about effectively Scotland subsidising England when it comes to energy, producing most of the renewables, but also having to pay excessive costs just to get that energy plugged into the grid. So, yeah, there's certainly not a one-way traffic when it comes to subsidies. The other issue I thought you just brought up there is a question of, well, you call it love bombing. It makes sense for any politician in power in London to look, at least in public, look friendly when you hear a Scottish voice. But I'm wondering how that works in the Labour Party, because the Scottish Labour leader had a big speech to make on Scotland's future, and of course he made it not in Scotland but in London. Now, the kind of language I hear from some people in the Labour Party doesn't exactly strike me as love bombing. We may remember Lisa Nandy, a left winger, saying a few months ago that the British state ought to consider a Catalan type solution to dealing with the Scots. So you say, maybe he's smiling, of course, he's obviously being a professional politician, Johnson, but you don't see a lot of smiling faces in Labour, the London Labour, when they're talking about Scotland, do they?
No, 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 and Keir Starmer's latest, departure, should I say, and I'll put that in inverted commas, departure from their stance on Brexit and rejoining the EU. Again, this is just I don't want anything to change at this moment in time. I want Boris Johnson to stay as Prime Minister, and I want Keir Starmer to remain in opposition and be spouting out this complete mince, the fact that they are going to disregard the 62% of people in Scotland who voted to remain in the European Union. That should remove the last bastion MP in Scotland, and I'm talking about Pillsbury boy Ian Murray up in Edinburgh. You know, that I mean, they have got absolutely no credibility. His announcement yesterday, and it wasn't actually. It wasn't actually televised. It was caught on mobile phone camera. It was not orchestrated as you know, a general PR where you know journalists and television cameras were invited to cover the speech, and it shows flagrant regard for the whole of Scottish Labour members. And I urge former comrades to think about your position in that party, because that party is going to implode if it hasn't done already. This is just simply, again, I was talking about democracy deniers earlier on, and this is exactly the attack that Anna Sawar is going down. Now that a couple of weeks ago, Scottish Labour were at loggerheads with the STUC. Now they're at loggerheads with their own membership, who actually voted to remain in Britain, but also voted to remain within the EU, and that is going to garner that is that. To use the words of Mr. James O'Brien, that is not going to butter any parsnips north of the border, that's for sure.
Yes, it's mystery to me to how Anna Sarah thinks he's going to win back the trust of Scottish voters while ignoring what they actually voted for. But let's move on now to the legal, the actual document going to the Supreme Court in London. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon, in making her announcement last week that the Scottish independence referendum will be in October 2023, she also at the same time said that the Lord Advocate, who's the chief law officer in Scotland, has been asked to make a submission to the Supreme Court in London, asking whether the Scottish Parliament has the power to do that on its own, with or without the support of Westminster. So the Lord, I'm just going to read out the press release here. The Lord Advocate's reference to the Supreme Court on whether the Scottish Parliament has the power to legislate for an independence referendum has now been published. The Lord Advocate's full written case will be filed in due course. So if you want to look at the Scottish Parliament website, you can read the full reference which the Lord Advocate is bringing to London, and there will be more detail on that later, arguing that the Scottish Parliament can in fact decide on its own. The Scottish Independence Referendum Bill, which accompanies that reference, was published last week and sets out that a consultative independence referendum would be held on the 19th of October 2023. In order to establish whether the Scottish Parliament can pass the bill, the Lord Advocate has asked the Supreme Court to decide if the matter is devolved under the Scotland Act of 1998. The Lord Advocate decided to make the Supreme Court reference following the consideration of a number of factors, including the constitutional significance of the matter and the fact that issues of law remain unresolved. The Culture, Europe and International Development Minister for the Scottish Government is Neil Gray, and he said there's a substantial majority in the Scottish Parliament in favour of an independence referendum, and therefore a clear democratic mandate. However, as the First Minister set out last week, there remains a debate over whether the Scottish Parliament has the powers to legislate to hold a referendum. A Supreme Court decision on the matter seeks to accelerate us to that point where we have legal clarity. We hope that it will be deemed to be within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. If that outcome is secured, then we will introduce the bill. While that decision now rests in the hands of the Supreme Court, we will not comment on the arguments in the case. Our focus remains clear, and we will continue to set out a strong and compelling case for Scotland to become an independent country. Now, Chris, is it about law or is it about politics? It's about the Scotland Act of 1998, and what exactly does it say? What are the powers of the Scottish Parliament and what has been reserved in Westminster? So this hasn't happened, of course, before. So it's up to the Supreme Court judges to decide. Do you think they're going to decide purely on the basis of law, or are outside political factors going to creep into their thinking?
No, I think it's, you know, and I'm obviously not a law officer, but you know, I would think that the whole reason that Nicola has done this is to point out the fact that it is unequivocal, if it goes our way, that it is unequivocal in law that the continuance of being in this voluntary union is for us to decide. And if the majority, then it gets political. If the pro-independence parties actually win the general election, then it is unequivocal. It must be accepted and cannot be challenged. And what we have to be clear about. I tweeted about this the other day. There is the fact that we have now got a 3-on-3 in the Holyrood Parliament for the first time, actually. We now have a 3-on-3 where you have three unionist parties, the Tories, Labour, and the Lib Dems, clearly standing on an anti-European ticket. And we have got three independence parties, that's the SNP, the Greens, and ALBA, who are standing on a pro-European ticket. And basically, what that means is that if you want to be European, you must vote for Scottish independence. That is the only way to regain your European citizenship. If you wish to remain subservient to your lives being run by a cabal that is imploding day on day, then by all means subserviently vote for the unionist parties, because that is what they are voting for. They are not pushing the fact that they have got no case for the union. So therefore, what they have to do, the only case that they have to bring to this conversation is the fact that Britain is better being out of Europe than what it is within. And we all know the fact that that is not the case. And if that is the ticket that they're going to apply this election with, then I say bring it on, because the 62% by now must be nearer 75. I would suggest maybe even 79% pro European and pro independence.
To me, the interesting thing, before we move back onto the legal ruling and what that might imply, the interesting thing about the voting figures in Europe, Chris, is that although the city of Edinburgh voted no to independence, but it voted heavily to remain in Europe. You said 62% of Scots voted for Europe, but I think the figure was even higher in the city of Edinburgh. So if Edinburgh comes over to yes, then that's it, really. That would just say. Just before we move on to the next story, I was wondering what you thought about the kind of the political significance, if you like, of the Supreme Court decision. And by the way, it's not going to come out until something like December. They're going to have to read this long submission. Then the UK government's going to make another long submission. Then all the justices have to read it and have lots of time to think about it. So December anyway. But I'm just wondering what happens if the Supreme Court says no, the Scottish Government does not have the power. Clearly, that's not inside the 1998 Act. Obviously, the Unionists will then have a party and say, we have won. But it's not a case of win or lose. It's a case of, as Nicholas Sturgeon's made it clear, seeking clarity, isn't it? So most people think it's most likely that the Supreme Court will probably say, no, it's not really in the Scotland Act, so you can't do it. But that's not a defeat, is it? That's just a clarity, and then we'll know what to do next.
Yeah, and you're 100% correct in that, Hugh. I can almost see the headlines now as Scott Tories say that we have won, or unionist parties, champion the, whatever. Look, what it is the fact that Nicola is doing due diligence and being upfront and offering clarity, where obviously, has been bereft of the Westminster government clarity and leadership. This is her clearly showing clarity and unambiguous leadership by actually offering you know, a, a possible weak point to be clarified. You know, before if it's not upheld, then she has got a default position that that she can go to, as she clearly stated out, that any upcoming election will be fought on an independence ticket, and we need to see where we are, from there, and that's why I say that if Scotland do return a majority of independent minded MPs, then that's where we come down to being able to call the unionist politicians democracy deniers. Uh, you, you know, uh, the only quandary to that is the fact that even at our best, back in 2013, when we elected 57 out of 59, and it was only Alistair Carmichael and Ian Murray that was carrying the banner for the union. I really don't see. Oh, sorry, it was 56. I do apologise. It was 56. So I don't honestly see. Without their removal, I honestly don't see Westminster caving in.
Yep. Okay, so well, as I said before, we have to wait quite a while before we hear what the Supreme Court decides. And I'm going to look on to UK-wide questions. First of all, let's look at the economy. The Bank of England warned today that economic prospects for Britain and the world have darkened since the start of the year and told banks to ramp up capital buffers to ensure that they can weather the storm. The global economic outlook has deteriorated markedly. At a news conference after the Bank of England published its half-yearly financial stability report, Andrew Bailey, the bank's governor, said that global financial conditions as a whole have tightened significantly, and added that developments around the war in Ukraine would also be key. International forecasters such as the IMF and the OECD say that Britain is more susceptible to recession and persistently high inflation than other Western countries, all of whom are grappling with global energy and commodity market shocks. British banks were well placed to weather even a severe economic storm, the BOE said, although it said their capital ratios, while still strong, are expected to decline slightly in the coming quarters. Despite a worsening cost of living crunch, with inflation heading towards double digits, the Bank of England said that banks were resilient to debt vulnerabilities among households and businesses. The central bank also expressed unease over the health of core financial markets, such as the US and British government bonds, which were the subject of a dash for cash in March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic prompted panic selling. It said that core British markets, while still functional, have become more expensive to trade, and the bid-ask spreads on short-dated gilts more than doubling compared to the 2021 average. I'm going to come back to that sentence in a minute, Chris. Conditions could therefore deteriorate, especially if market volatility increases further, said the BOE. The bank also said it would conduct an in-depth analysis of the functioning of the commodities markets, with metals trade severely disrupted in March by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right, and let me just go over it. It's a bit technical, this one, Chris. So what the bank said at the end is that they become government bonds are more expensive to trade. I guess that means that their interest rates go up. So the government bond market is essential, of course, to financing governments. Governments have to be able to issue bonds to the city and get money in return, really. So what they're talking about, the bid-ask spread, that's the difference between what's offered and what actually gets paid by the markets. And that's on short-dated gilts. So anyway, I don't know how up-to-date you are on financial markets, but I think what it's saying is that it's potentially more difficult for governments to raise money by going to the city and issuing government bonds. And so that's one of the things that the Bank of England is worried about, but it doesn't seem to be causing a problem at the moment. What worries you about the economic storm that we're in? Is it the government's problem raising money, or is it the fact that it's always the poor people who suffer most?
Well, it's a mixture of both, to be honest with you. And I actually worry when the alarm bells are obviously ringing within the enclaves of capitalism, because they're putting this warning out that next year is going to be even worse than the year that we're currently going through, if the government don't act. Now, we know for a fact that in recent years the Tory government have bailed out the banks because they were having, their worst performance in decades, or now should I even say centuries, and they managed to steer their ship through the uncharted waters, before a possible recession, and this was pre-pandemic. So they've been able to, and all throughout the pandemic, the one commodity that the country has had to use and constantly trade, obviously, is currency. And whether it's a packet of chewing gum, or whether it's a, a more lavish expense of £6 for a packet of Lurpak butter, is the fact that commodities, trading in commodities always results in the government getting a kickback. If the government gets that kickback, it can pay back the money that it's borrowed from the banks, and therefore keep good liquidity between the two. And this is something that the Scottish government obviously cannot do because we can't borrow in the first place. So it is therefore prudent for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Paymaster General, and all the rest of it to have the most excellent of uh, relations with the Bank of England, which is the bank of last resort, may I point out as well. But the volatility in the European markets, and what is obviously happening, not just between Russia and Ukraine, but also trading markets around the world where war and civil unrest is actually affecting the global markets, have to be taken into account. But we have to remember the first big thing that has to be taken into account, and that is the fact that Britain decided to inflict the greatest act of self-harm upon itself by coming out of the biggest trading market that Britain was ever in. And so, you know, uh, this actually might be my last appearance when I say this, but it is squeaky bum time now, because honestly, the Bank of England, or the English banks that make up the Bank of England, they have to go cacanny now, because if the country does go into a recession next year, then they will be the first ones, or
Mhm.
one of the first ones actually, to feel the adverse effects of it, because they will still be required to prop up the government in order for the government to operate.
Okay, yes. So the story is about the gathering economic storm, difficult months ahead. Of course, we just have to underline that the banks, as you say, banks are registered with the Bank of England. They're not controlled by them, but they do have to show that they've got enough cash basically to pay their bills. So the Bank of England report, just to summarise, says that they don't think at the moment banks are in danger. They think they've got enough liquidity to keep them going, even if they have to survive some bad debts. Well, that's the story at the moment anyway. They think difficult storms ahead, but we're not going to sink, according to the Bank of England. Now, let me move on to another story about the economy. In the Westminster today, members were debating spending plans. This was called Estimates Day, which is a chance for members of the UK Parliament to debate and agree what the government should be spending its money on. In a statement released ahead of today's debate, the SNP urged the UK Work and Pensions Secretary to wake up to the reality and ensure putting cash into people's pockets is her priority to support people through a Tory-made cost of living crisis. After a decade of austerity, slow wage growth, and a range of brutal welfare cuts under the Tory government, poverty levels have increased, with the UK having the worst poverty and inequality levels in northwest Europe. The SNP's Work and Pensions Secretary Kirsty Blackman MP said it's clear that the only way Scotland will become a fairer country, which we are striving to be, is with independence after the UK government spent 12 years systematically dismantling the UK social security net. Kirsty Blackman said, "I am urging Therese Coffey to wake up to reality and use Estimates Day to ensure putting cash in people's pockets to help them through the cost of living crisis, which has been made worse by her own government, is the priority. People need money now and not months down the line." That means uplifting universal credit by £25 and extending this to legacy benefits, scrapping the 5-week wait and advanced loans in the universal credit system in favour of non-repayable grants, and updating some benefits as we have done in Scotland. However, given the raft of failures, brutal cuts and missed opportunities we've seen under the Westminster government over the last 12 years, I don't hold out much hope. And to conclude, Kirsty Blackman said, of course, she reminded us that the Scottish Government has brought in the Scottish Child Payment, which will be upgraded to £25 per child at the end of this year. And the Scottish Government has also mitigated the benefit tax and upgraded the benefits that the Scottish Government is responsible for. She says, this is Kirsty says, "It's all done this using its limited powers. Imagine how much more we could do if we had full fiscal powers, including the ability to borrow," as Chris said a minute ago, as well as a full welfare and employment powers. Right now, according to Kirsty Blackman, 85% of social security spending is reserved to Westminster. Okay, a chance to debate spending priorities. And of course, the issue of going into a recession, then, as I said earlier on, Chris, we know who's going to suffer worst, people who are already at the bottom of the heap. So there's plenty of money in Britain. The Rishi Sunak himself, of course, isn't out of a job. He's got plenty. Sajid Javid also is loaded. So if one of them takes over the top job, I think they'll be able to weather the economic crisis okay. But it's all about spending priorities, isn't it? So the Scottish Government, even with its limited means, has done its best to help, hasn't it?
Yeah, and again, Kirsty outlines that very eloquently, as she normally does, is the fact that with our track record and what we have done to try and mitigate, and I used to hate punctuating in the air, but I have to punctuate that, mitigate the worst of Tory austerity. If we hadn't mitigated the bedroom tax, if we haven't had to mitigate against the Tories taking £20 out of everybody's welfare payments, had we not had to mitigate against other Tory austerity measures, that money that Scotland could have as a surplus could be, invested into the Scottish economy in order to make Scotland more buoyant than what it actually is. But what we could look at is, conversely, the fact that at this moment in time, although we have to recognise the fact that there are people in the most poorest communities who are struggling right now, and this is long before we get to another round of energy price hikes in the autumn, is the fact that Scotland is actually performing quite well, quite adequately. And Scotland also, we have to remember, is the only country in the UK that has to balance the books. So therefore, Scotland has to produce a set of books that are quantifiable to the Westminster government as to what they have given us in Barnett consequentials. We cannot sit on a surplus and we cannot return a deficit. So therefore, under that, Scotland is doing its utmost for the poorest and in society by introducing the child benefit, uprooting it by another 5% at Christmas, as you rightly said. Rewarding people like me, an unpaid carer, twice a year for the work that I do, and the further benefits that could be rolled out within the limited powers of welfare that Scotland holds, will only show up the Tories to be the charlatans that they are. And that is why people like Theresa Coffey will never agree to the submissions that Kirsty Blackman proposed that she does. Instead, what they will do is they will indulge themselves in their own personal agendas, such as, the likes of HS2 and all the rest of it, and all these contracts, concerning MPs, lords, and peers, and Michelle Mone comes to mind, as one of them to benefit out of that. That will just constantly roll on, Hugh. Because we know from the past that this government is all for capitalism and not for the redistribution of wealth.
Okay, so let's just close on our final story. I wish we had more time to go into that, Chris, but I'm sure we'll talk again. Just finally, very briefly, you've probably heard already that Finland and Sweden are poised to become members of NATO. So I'll just very briefly go over the latest. It's that their membership has actually been formally accepted, and it now has to be ratified by all the other members of NATO in their own parliaments. There's not expected to be any problem there. But of course, one of the consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was supposed to be to tell NATO that it's advancing too far into the east, one of the consequences is, of course, is NATO has extended its border because Finland has a great deal of northern border with Russia, and so now that will be, well, once it's ratified by the NATO members, that's going to be a Russian border to a NATO border as well. So that's going to go ahead, it looks like. So that's a bit from me and from Chris tonight. So on a very interesting day, Chris, so we've just had to run out of time there because we were just excited to hear about that news from London that Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak have just over an hour ago announced they've resigned from the UK government, which is increasing on Johnson. We don't know who's going to be Prime Minister, if he's going to still hang on to the job. Tune in tomorrow. It's Scotland at 7. My colleague and have the news. I wonder if that will be his top story, Chris. So thank you for joining us again tonight. I'm sure we'll see you again, Chris. And
thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. And also up in Glasgow, there are a couple of our volunteers are in the studio producing tonight. So thank you for you two for doing that. We've got other members of the team beyond our shores in Europe, but I'll tell you more of that later, or maybe Andrew will. We've got some specials coming up. And so thanks for watching. And of course, if you're one of our regular subscribers, then this is really for you. So the people who have looked at our website there and signed up for £5 a month basic minimum, there's no upper limit. You can become one of our supporters, and it's you who are keeping Broadcasting Scotland going. You're our only source of income. So thanks for doing that. As I said last week, we're asking everyone to give us another hand now, and what we really need is your ideas, your skills, and your enthusiasm for politics in Scotland over the next year and a half, which is going to be very interesting, of course. So if you'd like to help and become one of the team, either behind the camera or in front of the camera, doing what Chris and I and the other volunteers do, then please get in touch. I'm sure there's something we can get you interested in Broadcasting Scotland. So that's it for Scotland at 7 tonight. So Andrew is doing the show tomorrow, and I will see you later. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.